Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight's story takes us to a chilling urban legend comes to life. The Cursed Bride of Cotswold tells the haunting tale of a bride who, on her wedding day, this ghostly horror story is filled with suspense, dark mysteries, and a shocking twist. Was the wedding cursed from the start? Or is there something far more sinister at play? Let's dig into the mystery, if you dare. The sun hung low over the quaint village of Cotswold, casting a soft golden glow over its cobbled streets and timber-framed cottages. It was the kind of place you'd see in a postcard, where life moved at a slow, peaceful pace. The villagers were friendly and familiar, always stopping for a chat, sharing stories, or helping each other out. Children ran down the streets, laughing as they played tag, while elderly couples sat on benches near the village square, talking about the past as they fed the birds. There was always the faint smell of fresh bread wafting from the bakery, and the sound of church bells ringing every hour, marking time in a way that felt almost eternal. Everything about Cotswold seemed perfect, picturesque, charming, and safe. But beneath the idyllic exterior, there was a darkness, a secret that hung over the village like an unspoken cloud. The locals never mentioned it directly to outsiders, but if you lived here long enough, you'd hear the whispers. There was something about Cotswold that made people uneasy when it came to weddings. The older generations always spoke in hushed tones when discussing it. The younger ones, who had grown up with the stories, always laughed it off until they couldn't. The story had been passed down for centuries. A curse, they said, one that was tied to the very land itself. A curse that followed the footsteps of any bride who dared to marry in Cotswold. The curse wasn't just some vague superstition or some silly tale meant to frighten children into behaving. No, it was real, or at least that's what the villagers believed. It was said that anyone who planned their wedding in Cotswold would meet a tragic, untimely death. But it wasn't just anyone who suffered the curse. It was always the bride. The legend told of a young woman named Eleanor, whose wedding day was meant to be the happiest day of her life. She had grown up in Cotswold, as had her parents and grandparents. The town had always been her world. She'd fallen in love with a charming, dashing young man from a neighboring village. Theirs was a love story that seemed straight out of a fairy tale, until the day of the wedding. The day started like any other, with the sun shining bright and the village bustling with excitement. Everyone had gathered in the small church at the heart of Cotswold, ready to witness the union of Eleanor and her fiancé, Thomas. The ceremony was set to take place in the early afternoon, with flowers lining the aisles and the scent of lavender filling the air. The church bells would ring, signaling the start of a new chapter for the young couple. It was to be a grand affair, one that the village would remember for years to come. But as Eleanor stood in her bridal gown waiting to walk down the aisle, something felt off. The air was thick with tension. Her mother, who had been so joyful and excited just the day before, looked strangely pale and nervous. Eleanor's best friend, Margaret, was avoiding her gaze, looking as though she had something heavy on her mind. But Eleanor, consumed with the excitement of the day, brushed off the strange behavior. She was about to marry the man she loved. What could go wrong? As she walked down the aisle, everything seemed perfect. The guests stood and smiled, admiring her beauty as she approached the altar. But when she reached the front of the church, her gaze met Thomas's, and for the first time, she saw something she hadn't noticed before. His eyes were cold, unnervingly cold. The warmth and affection that had once filled them had vanished, replaced with something dark. The smile on his face was forced, almost mocking, as though he was playing a role rather than celebrating a joyous occasion. Before she could question it, the ceremony began. The priest spoke. The vows were exchanged, but everything felt wrong. Eleanor's voice trembled as she said her "I do," but she couldn't quite place why. It was as though something in the very air had shifted, and the world around her had become distorted. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Eleanor didn't feel the joy she had expected. Instead, a sudden chill swept over her, and she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It wasn't until the reception, later that evening, that the full weight of the curse was revealed. Eleanor's family had gathered at the village hall for the celebration, the air alive with music and laughter. But as the night wore on, things took a darker turn. Eleanor noticed that several of the guests had begun acting strangely. They spoke in hushed tones, eyes darting nervously, as though they were waiting for something, waiting for the inevitable. And then it happened. Thomas, her new husband, disappeared. He hadn't left a note, and no one knew where he had gone. Panic set in among the villagers, and whispers spread like wildfire. The legend of Eleanor's curse was no longer a story. It was happening in real time. Eleanor searched for him all night. The town streets, which had once felt so warm and welcoming, now felt oppressive and cold. She wandered through the church, the village square, the cemetery, calling his name, her voice echoing back at her in the eerie silence of the night. But there was no answer. By morning, the truth came to light. Thomas had been found, dead. His body was discovered in the woods just outside the village, his face frozen in an expression of terror. No one could explain what had happened. Some said he'd been murdered. Others whispered that the curse had claimed him, just as it always did. The village mourned for Eleanor, but there was no escaping the dark reality. The curse had claimed another bride. The legend had come to life, and it had taken its due. For generations, the story of Eleanor's wedding was retold in hushed voices, warning those who dared to plan a wedding in Cotswold. No one dared to speak of it openly, but the curse was real. Everyone knew it, and everyone feared it. Years passed, and the town's history was slowly buried beneath the weight of time. But as the decades went on, the curse continued to haunt Cotswold. casting a long shadow over every wedding that was planned in the village. Some brides tried to defy the curse, believing that it was nothing more than an old superstition. But one by one, they too met their end. Now, many years later, Amelia, a bright-eyed young woman from London, found herself planning her wedding in Cotswold. She had always dreamed of a wedding in a picturesque village, and Cotswold seemed like the perfect place. She had no idea about the curse that had haunted the village for centuries. She didn't believe in such things, thinking them to be nothing more than old wives' tales meant to scare children. She had fallen in love with James, her high school sweetheart, and they had spent years dreaming of this day. The small village church, with its ivy-clad stone walls and arched wooden doors, was the perfect place for their ceremony. James had agreed without hesitation when she suggested the idea of getting married in Cotswold. What could possibly go wrong? Amelia was excited. She had every detail of the wedding planned down to the last flower petal. The village seemed like the perfect place for a fresh start, a place where they could begin their new life together. She had no reason to believe that the whispers of the curse had any weight. To her, they were just stories for tourists and superstitious people. Her wedding would be a perfect, joyous day, free of fear and full of love. But as she arrived in Cotswold, the strange feeling that something wasn't right crept into her thoughts. The village, while beautiful and charming, seemed to carry a weight in the air. The villagers, though friendly, gave her strange looks, their smiles just a little too tight, their eyes a little too guarded. They asked no questions when she mentioned her wedding, but she could sense the unease in their voices, the way they quickly changed the subject. Amelia pushed the feeling aside, thinking it was just the nerves of planning a big event. After all, what could possibly go wrong in this picture-perfect village? Little did she know, her wedding day would soon become a nightmare, and the curse of Eleanor was about to claim its next victim. She had no idea that the dark secret of Cotswold was about to unfold before her eyes, and her dream wedding would turn into a fight for survival against a curse that no one could escape. Amelia had always been a grounded person, the kind who dismissed the idea of ghost stories, superstitions, or anything supernatural. She had always thought of herself as practical, logical, and rational. Growing up in a world of facts and figures, she never saw any reason to entertain stories about curses or haunted places. She believed that things could be explained by science, that there was always a reasonable explanation for everything. After all, that was how the world worked. Or so she thought. But one night, after a long and exhausting day of wedding preparations, Amelia's certainty about the world around her was shattered by a dream. She had just spent hours going over final details for her wedding to James, making sure everything was perfect, from the flowers to the seating arrangements. She'd been so busy with the planning that her exhaustion hit her all at once when she finally settled into bed. Her head hit the pillow, and she quickly drifted into sleep, unaware of the strange journey her mind was about to take. In her dream, She was standing in front of the church where she was supposed to marry James in just a few days. It looked exactly like she remembered it, small, old, and covered in ivy. The stone wall seemed to absorb the warmth of the day, giving the church a timeless, almost magical quality. But as she stood there, something felt terribly wrong. The church, which had always seemed so inviting in daylight, was now shrouded in shadows. The sky overhead was pitch black. Like the depth of a storm had settled in, though there was no sign of rain or wind. It was as if the night had arrived too soon, and with it came a chill that settled deep in her bones. Amelia looked down at herself and realized that she wasn't wearing the wedding dress she had carefully chosen for her big day. The dress she was wearing now was something entirely different. Old, yellowed with age, and made from a fabric that looked worn and fragile. It was as though it had been hidden away in some forgotten corner of time, gathering dust and secrets. The lace on the bodice was torn in places, and the fabric felt rough against her skin. Unlike the soft silk she had expected to wear, she reached out to adjust the dress, but her hands trembled, unsure of what she was touching. It didn't feel right, not in the way that the gown she had bought for her wedding had. This dress felt cursed somehow. Her heart began to race, but she couldn't move. It was as though her body refused to respond, her limbs frozen in place, locked in a moment of dread. She was standing at the entrance of the church, facing the massive wooden doors, but something felt off. The silence was suffocating. There were no sounds of guests, no chatter, no laughter. It was as though everyone had disappeared, leaving her alone in the cold, dark churchyard. And then the bells rang. But this was no ordinary wedding bell. The sound was heavy and deep. Unlike the joyful, celebratory ring she had imagined hearing on her wedding day. It didn't signal the beginning of a new chapter of love. It was a mournful, hollow sound, like a death knell that reverberated in her chest. Amelia flinched at the noise, the ringing vibrating in her skull. She looked up to see the bell tower, but no one was there. There was no priest, no guests, no familiar faces. It was as though the wedding was meant to happen, but had been twisted into something dark and terrible. Compelled by something she couldn't understand, Amelia took a step forward, moving toward the open doors of the church. As she walked, the air grew colder, and the sky above grew darker still. The warm light that should have illuminated the church was gone, replaced by an unnatural, unsettling darkness. It was as though the world itself had turned against her, and every step she took led her deeper into a nightmare she couldn't escape. Her footsteps echoed loudly in the silence, each sound amplified in the empty space. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her body moved forward against her will. She was walking down the aisle of the church, but the wooden pews on either side were empty. The once pristine church had been abandoned, forgotten, as if it had been waiting for her to arrive. The only thing that remained was the eerie stillness and the hollow sound of her shoes hitting the stone floor. And then, as she neared the altar, she saw it. A shadowy figure stood at the far end of the aisle. At first, Amelia couldn't make out who or what it was, but as she got closer, the figure came into focus. It was a woman, dressed in a wedding gown, but there was something wrong about her, something disturbingly wrong. The woman's figure was obscured by a long, flowing veil that covered her face, but Amelia could still see the shape of her body, unnervingly still, unmoving. As she drew nearer, a cold shiver ran down Amelia's spine. The woman's presence felt unnatural, like a spectral echo of something long forgotten. Amelia stopped in her tracks, unable to move any closer. The figure was there, but it wasn't alive. There was no warmth in her stance, no hint of joy. She was a silhouette of sorrow, a ghostly echo of what was supposed to be a beautiful occasion. Amelia felt a sudden pull in her chest, a feeling that something wasn't right. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of the scene before her, but she couldn't. The woman's veil fluttered slightly, and for a brief moment, Amelia saw the face beneath it. It was lifeless. The face that stared back at her was not the face of a bride, but of someone long dead. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her eyes were hollow, devoid of any emotion. There was no light, no life, nothing in those eyes but emptiness. Her lips were cracked, as though they hadn't spoken in years, and her hair was wild, tangled, and covered in dust. The woman's face was a mask of death, a reminder of a wedding that had long since been shattered. Amelia's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the woman. There was no sound in the church now. No bells, no footsteps, no voices, just the haunting stillness and the figure in front of her. Her heart hammered in her chest as she felt a cold, terrifying realization settle over her. This was no ordinary wedding. It was the curse. The same curse that had haunted the village for centuries, and she had walked straight into it. Before Amelia could react, the figure reached out, her hand emerging from beneath the veil. It was pale, almost translucent, and her fingers curled toward Amelia, as though beckoning her forward. But Amelia couldn't move. She couldn't even speak. She was frozen in place, caught in the grip of a nightmare she couldn't escape. The woman's lips parted, but no sound came out. Amelia could see her mouth moving, but the words were lost in the oppressive silence. It was as if the woman was trying to communicate, to say something, but the words couldn't reach her. Instead, all Amelia heard was the echo of her own heartbeat, loud and frantic in her ears. And then, as suddenly as it began, the scene shifted. The woman's face distorted, melting into something unrecognizable. Amelia's vision blurred, and the church, once so clear and tangible, began to fade away, replaced by an overwhelming darkness. The last thing she saw was the woman's outstretched hand, and then everything went black. Amelia woke up with a start. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her body slick with sweat. She was tangled in her sheets, her heart racing in her chest as though she had just run a marathon. The dream had felt so real, too real. She sat up in bed, looking around her dark bedroom. But everything was still. It was only the middle of the night, the moon casting a soft light through the window. She could hear the distant sounds of the village, but nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, the dream lingered in her mind, its images seared into her memory. The lifeless woman in the wedding gown, the coldness of the church, the sound of the ominous bell, the feeling of being trapped in something far beyond her understanding. Amelia tried to shake it off, but a gnawing feeling in her stomach told her that the dream wasn't just a random figment of her imagination. It felt like a warning she didn't know how to interpret. As she lay back down, trying to convince herself it was nothing more than stress from the wedding preparations, the chill of the dream still clung to her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that the curse, whatever it was starting to make its presence known. And deep down, she knew that the worst was yet to come. Amelia had been planning her wedding for months, and she couldn't contain her excitement as she spoke to Sarah about the upcoming event. The two of them had been friends since childhood, and despite Sarah moving away from Cotswold years ago, they still kept in touch regularly. Amelia had always admired Sarah's connection to the village, with all its stories and traditions, but she had never really paid much attention to the darker side of Cotswold. Sarah had grown up there and knew all about the village's strange history, but to Amelia, those stories were just that, stories. As Amelia gushed about the details of her wedding, the choice of venue, the flowers, the dress, everything, she could sense that Sarah wasn't responding the way she usually did. Normally, Sarah would be right there with her, sharing in the excitement, but today she seemed distant. Her responses slower than usual. Amelia frowned as she noticed how pale Sarah's face had become. Her friend's usual lightheartedness had been replaced with something darker, more serious. "Are you sure you want to get married here?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice trembling slightly, as if she were reluctant to speak the words. Amelia stopped mid-sentence, confused by the sudden shift in Sarah's demeanor. "What do you mean? What's wrong with Cotswold?" she asked, trying to lighten the mood, unsure if Sarah was joking. Sarah's gaze darkened, her eyes narrowing as she looked out of the window. She wasn't avoiding Amelia's eyes, but it was clear she was struggling with something. Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve, her hands betraying the tension in her body. "You don't understand," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's a reason why people avoid getting married in Cotswold. You may think it's just a quaint village with a beautiful church, but there's something else. Something the villagers don't like to talk about. Something they keep hidden. The curse." Sarah trailed off, as if she had said too much already. Amelia frowned. The curse? Was Sarah serious? She hadn't mentioned anything about a curse before, and this sounded absurd. The more Sarah hesitated, the more Amelia's skepticism grew. "What curse, Sarah?" she asked with a laugh, thinking her friend was just being overly dramatic, maybe trying to play the role of the protective best friend a little too well. It's all superstition, isn't it? People like to make up stories, but there's nothing to be afraid of. It's just an old legend. Nothing more. Sarah's eyes darkened further, and for a moment, Amelia thought she saw fear in them. Fear that seemed out of place in a conversation about something as trivial as wedding plans. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly reluctant to go any further. But she seemed to be on the verge of saying something important. "It's not just superstition," Sarah said, her voice barely audible now, as if she were afraid of being overheard. "It's real. The curse of the bride, Amelia. The curse that follows every woman who gets married in Cotswold. I'm serious. The people here, they know the stories, but no one talks about it. They pretend it's not real, but I know better. I've seen it. I've heard the stories from the elders, the ones who remember the past, and they all say the same thing. Don't get married here, not in Cotswold." Amelia felt a chill run down her spine, but she shook it off, trying to keep her tone light. Sarah had always been the more superstitious of the two, always the one to believe in ghost stories and old legends. Amelia had always rolled her eyes at those kinds of things. She never believed in curses or haunted places. Everything had an explanation. Even if she didn't understand it right away, she knew that it would all make sense in the end. "Come on, Sarah," Amelia said with a nervous laugh. "I think you've been watching too many horror movies. It's just a village with a little history, and sure, maybe there are a few ghost stories floating around. But a curse? That's a little extreme, don't you think?" Sarah looked at her, her eyes filled with a sadness that Amelia couldn't quite place. "I wish it were just a story, Amelia. I really do. But the curse, it's not just something that people talk about in whispers. It's something that's real, something that happens to every bride who dares to get married in Cotswold. You think you're safe, but you're not. You don't know what you're walking into." Amelia shook her head. "I think you're just getting yourself worked up. There's no curse, Sarah. You're just worried because I'm getting married, and you're trying to scare me. Well, it's not going to work. I'm getting married in Cotswold, and I'll have the wedding I've always dreamed of. Nothing's going to stop me." Sarah's expression softened, and she sighed deeply, her shoulders slumping, as if she had just lost the battle. She remained silent for a moment, staring at her hands folded in her lap. Amelia could tell that Sarah was still worried, but she didn't know how to make her friend understand that she wasn't going to be swayed by old stories. Amelia wanted to reassure Sarah that everything would be fine, that nothing was going to ruin her wedding. But deep down, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right about the whole situation. Why was Sarah so insistent on this? Why did her friend seem so convinced that the curse was real? "You don't have to believe me," Sarah said softly, as if she had read Amelia's mind. "I can't make you believe, but just know this. There's something about this place, something that you can't see, and it's been here for centuries. People have tried to ignore it, to pretend it doesn't exist, but it's real. And I just don't want you to be the next victim." Amelia felt a knot form in her stomach. She had never seen Sarah so serious, so frightened. She had always thought of Sarah as a bit of a romantic, someone who got caught up in old myths and ghost stories. But there was something in her eyes now that made Amelia question everything. It wasn't like Sarah to talk like this. It wasn't like her to sound so desperate. Amelia knew her friend well enough to understand that Sarah wasn't just being dramatic. There was something in her voice, something in the way she looked at Amelia, that made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was more to this story than she had thought. But even with all the doubt and unease settling in her mind, Amelia couldn't bring herself to believe in the curse. She had spent so many months planning this wedding, imagining the life she would share with James. Everything was falling into place. Cotswold was the perfect village for a fairy tale wedding. She couldn't just let a silly old legend stop her from living out her dream. "I'm not worried, Sarah," Amelia said, trying to sound confident. "I appreciate you looking out for me, but I'm going to have the wedding I want. I've been dreaming of this day for so long, and nothing is going to ruin it." Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line, and she nodded. But Amelia could see the fear still lingering in her friend's eyes. "I hope you're right," she whispered, almost to herself. "I really do." As the days went by, Amelia found herself thinking more and more about Sarah's warning. She couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled in her chest, but she quickly dismissed it. She had made up her mind. Cotswold was beautiful, and the church was perfect. She wasn't going to let anything spoil her happiness. And yet, every time she stepped into the village, every time she wandered the cobblestone streets, the unease lingered just below the surface. The whispers seemed to follow her wherever she went. The villagers, who had always been warm and friendly, now gave her looks that were hard to decipher. Looks that made her feel as though she were an outsider. And the older villagers, especially, avoided her gaze as though they knew something she didn't. One evening, as Amelia sat by the window in her rented cottage, looking out over the village, she saw an elderly woman standing on the edge of the square. The woman was hunched over, her hands clasped together as if in prayer. Her eyes were fixed on the church, and Amelia could swear that the woman was watching her. There was something in her gaze that made Amelia shiver, a look of sadness, but also something deeper, something more sorrowful. It was then that Amelia realized that maybe, just maybe, Sarah wasn't the only one who knew something about this place. Maybe the curse wasn't just a story after all. And as Amelia turned away from the window, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, something she couldn't control. The day before the wedding, Amelia arrived at the church with a flutter of excitement, trying to keep her nerves in check. The final preparations were taking place, and the church was filled with a mix of bustling workers and the gentle hum of anticipation. It was everything she had dreamed of. The sun streamed through the stained glass windows, casting vibrant colors across the stone walls. The air was thick with the scent of fresh flowers, and the faint echo of footsteps reverberated in the quiet space as the last few touches were being added. Yet, as Amelia moved through the church, something began to feel off. The grandeur of the place, once so charming, now felt oppressive. The high ceilings loomed above her, casting long, unnerving shadows that seemed to stretch out toward her. She brushed it off at first. She was simply overwhelmed by the pressure of the upcoming wedding, that was all. But with each step, the unease grew stronger. The church was old, ancient even, with its wooden pews polished smooth by the hands of countless worshippers over the centuries. The walls, weathered by time, seemed to whisper their own secrets, and Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that the space was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone. She wandered down the aisle, running her fingers lightly along the back of the pews, her eyes scanning the details she hadn't noticed before. She had always thought of the church as beautiful, almost magical in its tranquility, but today it felt different. The silence was profound, almost suffocating. The usual hum of conversation, the rustling of paper, and the occasional burst of laughter were replaced by an eerie stillness, as though the church itself was holding its own secret. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper than usual, and the flickering candles, which should have given a soft glow, only made the atmosphere feel more haunting. Amelia paused, trying to shake off the unsettling thoughts that kept creeping in. As she walked further into the church, a sudden chill swept over her. It was as if someone had opened a door to a cold, desolate place. Amelia glanced around, instinctively scanning the empty church for any sign of life. But there was no one there. The workers had finished their tasks and left hours ago, and the only sound was the faint creaking of the wooden floor beneath her feet. She took another step, and then another, but the air seemed heavier with each movement. She stopped, standing still for a moment as her breath caught in her throat. There, at the far end of the church, the shadow of the altar seemed to grow darker, more intense, as though something was lurking there, waiting. Her heartbeat quickened. She turned around, scanning the aisle behind her, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching her. But there was no one. The church was empty, just as it had been moments ago. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. It was as if an unseen presence was standing just beyond her line of sight, lurking in the corners, waiting to make itself known. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to run away from the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over her. But she forced herself to take a deep breath, shaking her head as though trying to dismiss the thoughts. It was nothing, just nerves. The wedding had her stressed, and she was letting her imagination run wild. She was fine. She just needed to finish the last few details and go home. But then, just as she was about to turn and head toward the entrance, She heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible, like a breath on her neck. The sound sent a wave of terror through her, and for a moment, she froze in place. The voice was so faint, so quiet, that it could have easily been mistaken for the wind. But Amelia was certain of one thing. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the creaking of the church. It was something else. Run, before it's too late.
Words echoed in her mind, sending a chill down her spine. The voice was smooth, almost soothing, but there was an urgency in it, an unmistakable warning. Amelia's heart raced, her blood running cold as the voice seemed to linger in the air around her, filling the empty space of the church. She spun around quickly, her eyes darting in every direction, trying to catch sight of who had spoken. But once again, the church was completely still. No one was there. No one had spoken. The place was as empty as it had been when she first entered. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her pulse hammering in her ears as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. It had felt so real, so vivid. There was no mistaking it. The words had been clear, and yet she had heard nothing but silence when she turned. She had been alone in the church, hadn't she? Amelia's thoughts were racing now. Was it just her imagination? Had the stress of the wedding finally gotten to her? She tried to convince herself that it was nothing more than a trick of the mind, a fleeting moment brought on by the anxiety of the upcoming ceremony. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. The feeling of being watched hadn't left her. The coldness still lingered, wrapping around her like an invisible hand. Someone was there, just beyond the edges of her perception. She walked slowly down the aisle, her steps cautious now, as if afraid to disturb the silence. The church, which had once felt like a place of peace and joy, now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in on her, and the air grew thick, heavy with an unspoken dread. She didn't know what to do. Should she leave? Should she go outside, get some fresh air, and clear her head? But the moment she turned toward the door, she felt it again. The coldness. It swept over her like a wave, freezing her to the spot. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest, and she swallowed hard. She had to leave. She couldn't stay in this place any longer. She turned toward the entrance again, this time with purpose. But as her hand reached for the door handle, she heard it. A low, guttural sound, like a groan, coming from somewhere deep within the church. It wasn't a sound she had ever heard before. Certainly not in this church, where only the sounds of footsteps and murmurs filled the air. This sound was dark, deep, and full of sorrow. Amelia's hand froze on the door handle, her body rigid with fear. She didn't know what it was, but she felt it now, deep in her bones. A presence. Something that didn't belong in this place. The sound of a whisper came again, clearer this time. "It's too late," the voice said, and this time it was different. There was no warning, no sense of urgency, just a quiet finality. Amelia's heart stopped for a moment. The room felt smaller.
the shadows creeping closer, as if the very walls of the church were closing in around her. She turned around slowly, her breath shallow, and there it was. At the far end of the aisle, the altar stood before her. The candles flickered, casting strange shadows on the stone floor. And then she saw it. A figure, a woman, standing motionless at the altar, her back to Amelia, as if waiting for her. The figure wore a long, white veil that cascaded down her back. The dress was old-fashioned, the fabric tattered and yellowed with age. Amelia's chest tightened, and she fought the urge to scream. Her legs felt like they were made of stone, and she couldn't move. The woman stood perfectly still, as if she had been waiting there for an eternity. "Who are you?" Amelia whispered, her voice trembling.
But the woman did not respond. She simply stood there unmoving, her figure shrouded in the pale light of the candles. Amelia's eyes darted around the church, desperately searching for something, anything that could explain what she was seeing. But there was no one else, only the woman at the altar. "Run," the voice whispered again, and this time it wasn't just in her mind. The voice was real, tangible, echoing in the empty church. "Run before it's too late." Amelia could feel the fear rising in her throat, choking her. She wanted to turn and run, to escape, but her legs refused to move. She was trapped. She couldn't look away. The figure at the altar slowly turned, the veil moving with a strange, unnatural fluidity. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest as she saw the woman's face. But it wasn't a face. It was empty, hollow, a black void where eyes should have been, and an expression that twisted into something grotesque. The skin was pale, stretched tight across the bones, and the lips parted in a silent scream. Amelia's blood ran cold, and in that moment she knew this wasn't a dream. This was real. The curse of Cotswold had come for her, and she was too late to escape. The morning of the wedding arrived, and Amelia could hardly contain the excitement that had been building up for months. The church was ready, the guests were arriving, and everything was falling into place just as she had envisioned. Her heart raced with anticipation, and as she stepped into the bridal gown, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. This was it, the day she had dreamed of since she was a little girl. She was about to marry James, her high school sweetheart, in the beautiful church in Cotswold. It was supposed to be a fairy tale, a perfect day filled with love and happiness. Amelia stood in front of the large mirror, adjusting the lace of her dress. Her reflection smiled back at her, glowing with joy and excitement. She was stunning. The dress fit her perfectly, and her makeup was flawless. She had never felt more beautiful. Her heart fluttered as she thought about James waiting for her at the altar, looking dashing in his black suit. She imagined the moment when they would exchange vows, promising to love and cherish each other for the rest of their lives. It was going to be the happiest day of her life. But as she stepped out of the bridal suite, ready to walk down the aisle,
A strange sense of unease washed over her. It wasn't overwhelming, just a slight prickling at the back of her mind. Maybe it was the nerves, the pressure of the big day, or maybe the weight of her own thoughts. She couldn't quite place it, but something felt off.
The ceremony had already begun, and as Amelia walked toward the church, the doors opened wide. The soft glow of sunlight spilled into the space, and Amelia stepped inside, taking in the sight before her. The church was filled with flowers, white roses and lilies adorning every available surface, their fragrance thick in the air. The guests were all in their seats, their faces beaming with smiles, their eyes glistening with happiness. The soft murmur of quiet conversation filled the air, but all Amelia could focus on was the man standing at the altar, James, looking at her with a smile that could melt anyone's heart. Amelia's heart leaped as she took her first step toward him. The aisle stretched out before her, the petals scattered on the floor beneath her feet. Her hand, which was resting gently on her father's arm, tightened slightly, but she didn't know if it was from excitement or nervousness. The crowd stood to greet her, and she could hear their soft whispers, the admiration in their voices. Amelia smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. There was something that still gnawed at her, but she couldn't place what it was. As she walked down the aisle, she felt the weight of everyone's gaze on her, their eyes following her every move. But for some reason, it felt different. It felt like they weren't looking at her, they were looking past her, through her, as if they were waiting for something else to happen. She couldn't explain it, but the sensation made her feel like she wasn't entirely present in the moment. When she reached the altar, James took her hand and she looked into his eyes. His smile was warm, reassuring, and for a moment, everything felt right. But as the priest began to speak, Amelia's mind began to wander. She could hear the soft rustling of the ceremony, the sound of the priest's voice, but there was an undercurrent of noise. Something else, something faint yet persistent. It was like the hum of an old machine, low and steady, just beneath the surface of everything else. She shook her head slightly, trying to clear the distraction from her mind. It was just nerves. It had to be. A bell rang then, the signal that the vows were about to be exchanged, and as the sound resonated through the church, Amelia felt a strange shiver run down her spine. It wasn't the joyful, celebratory chime she had imagined. No, it was deeper, resonating through her chest, vibrating against her bones. The bell's tone was rich, but heavy, almost ominous. For a split second, it felt as if the very air in the room had shifted, becoming thicker, heavier. It sent a cold rush of fear through her, and she suddenly felt a chill on the back of her neck. Amelia tried to shake off the feeling, trying to focus on James's face, but something made her glance toward the back of the church. There, standing in the shadow of the large wooden doors, was a figure. At first, she couldn't quite make it out, but as her eyes adjusted, the figure became clearer. A woman, standing perfectly still, her back facing the altar. The figure was dressed in white, but not the clean, fresh white of Amelia's wedding dress. This woman's gown was yellowed with age, tattered at the edges, and she wore a veil that covered her face completely. Her presence was unsettling, almost unnatural. Amelia froze, her hand still gripping James's tightly. A strange, sinking feeling flooded her chest, as though the ground beneath her was shifting, threatening to swallow her whole. The woman at the back of the church stood perfectly still, watching Amelia, or at least that's what it felt like. Amelia couldn't see her face, but she felt those eyes, hidden beneath the veil, staring into her soul. The woman's presence seemed to draw the room's energy into a stillness, a coldness that seemed to settle on everything and everyone. Amelia's breath quickened, and her heart hammered in her chest. What was happening? Who was that woman? Why was she standing there? She tried to dismiss it, telling herself it was just her imagination playing tricks. Maybe it was just the nerves getting to her. She tried to focus on the priest's voice, on the vows she was about to take. But the strange figure in the back of the church lingered in her thoughts. She felt a tightening in her chest, a deep, foreboding sensation that seemed to choke the very air from her lungs. And then the woman smiled. Amelia's blood ran cold. The smile was not warm or loving. It wasn't even a welcoming smile, as one would expect from someone at a wedding. No, this smile was something darker, something twisted. It was a smile filled with malice, with hatred. The kind of smile you would expect from someone who had waited a long time to claim something that belonged to them. Amelia's stomach twisted, and she felt the hairs on her arms stand on end. Her grip on James's hand tightened, and she looked up at him, trying to steady herself. He was looking at her, his expression calm, reassuring. He smiled at her with that same loving smile that always made her feel safe. But today, it wasn't enough. The image of the woman standing in the back of the church with her unsettling smile lingered in Amelia's mind. "Amelia, you okay?" James's voice brought her back to the moment, and she looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. She nodded quickly, trying to push the panic down inside of her. It wasn't like her to feel this way. She had always prided herself on being strong, on keeping a level head. But this was something different, something she couldn't explain. "I'm fine," she whispered, forcing a smile, but even she could hear the shakiness in her own voice. James gave her a puzzled look, but he didn't press the issue. He simply squeezed her hand gently, offering her a comforting smile before turning his attention back to the priest. But Amelia couldn't shake the feeling. Something was wrong. There was something in the air, something lurking just beneath the surface. She felt it more than she heard it. The presence of the figure in the back of the church, the coldness, the heaviness that had settled over the room. The ceremony continued, but Amelia's mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop glancing toward the back of the church, toward the woman who had now disappeared. Had she moved? Was she still there? Amelia tried to focus on the vows being exchanged, on the moment she was supposed to be cherishing. But her thoughts kept returning to that shadowy figure, to the smile, to the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The priest's voice seemed to fade in the background, and Amelia's vision began to blur as she fought to push the panic back down. She wasn't sure how long the ceremony lasted. It could have been minutes, or it could have been hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning. All she could focus on was the cold, creeping feeling that something was about to happen. Something that she wasn't prepared for. The final "I do" was spoken, and she heard the priest announce them as husband and wife. But the words didn't register. The church erupted into applause, but Amelia didn't hear it. She was lost in the strange, swirling chaos of her own thoughts, trying to hold on to the fleeting thread of normalcy that was rapidly slipping away from her. She looked at James again, and his smile seemed a little too wide, a little too forced. Something was terribly wrong. The woman's smile flashed in her mind again, and Amelia knew that it wasn't over. Something dark had followed her into this day, and the worst was yet to come. Amelia stood frozen in place, the weight of the ceremony pressing down on her. The vows had been exchanged. The ring slipped onto her finger, and the words, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," had filled the air with an ethereal joy that was supposed to mark the beginning of their happily ever after. But instead of the warmth she had anticipated, an icy sensation had settled deep inside her chest, squeezing her heart. Every breath she took felt shallow, like she was suffocating, the air thick with something she couldn't name. Her eyes darted around, trying to hold on to the moment, trying to keep her focus, but everything felt wrong. The familiar comfort of the church, the faces of their loved ones beaming with happiness, had faded into the background. All she could see was the figure standing in front of the altar, the same figure she had seen in her dream. The woman in the yellowed wedding gown, the lifeless figure who had watched her from the shadows. There she was, standing at the altar, her form still as stone, just beyond the edge of Amelia's vision. Her veil fluttered, though there was no breeze in the air, and the dim light from the candles made her appear even more spectral. The woman's face, still obscured by the veil, seemed to stare directly at Amelia, her presence suffocating the joy that had once filled the church. Amelia's breath caught in her throat, and her pulse quickened. She was certain it was the same woman from her dream, the same haunting figure that had warned her in the church. Amelia's mind raced, spinning with confusion and fear. Was this a hallucination? Had the pressure of the wedding gotten to her? Was she imagining things? She tried to push the image away, tried to focus on James beside her. But every time she turned her attention back to the altar, the woman remained there. Her presence seemed to draw the very warmth from the room, leaving only a chilling coldness in its wake. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest, and her hands, which had been holding James's, suddenly felt clammy and cold. She couldn't stop the shaking that began to ripple through her, though she tried to hide it. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, trying to regain her composure. She had to stay calm. She couldn't let her imagination get the best of her. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. She had to focus on James, on the vows they had just exchanged, and the future they had ahead of them. But when she opened her eyes again, the woman was still there. Only now, she was closer. Her presence loomed over the altar, and though Amelia couldn't see her face clearly, she could feel the weight of her gaze. It was as though the woman was watching her, waiting for something. A cold shiver ran down Amelia's spine, and her breath hitched as she felt something, a voice, whisper directly into her ear. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it was there. A chilling breath against her skin, the words impossibly clear, like they had been spoken directly into her soul. You will die, just like Eleanor. Your wedding will be your last. The words were like a heavy blow, and Amelia's mind reeled with the implications. Her knees wobbled beneath her, and for a brief moment, she thought she might collapse, right there in the middle of the church. But she forced herself to stay upright, even though every fiber of her being screamed for her to run. The dream, the warning, it had all been real. The curse, the bride's curse that Sarah had warned her about, it wasn't just a story. It wasn't superstition. It was happening. It was happening now. The words echoed in her mind, reverberating in her skull. Your wedding will be your last. She tried to speak, to call out for help, but her throat had gone dry. She couldn't breathe. The air around her had thickened, like a heavy fog, and she could barely see through the haze. The church, once full of life and joy, now felt like a tomb. The faces of her guests, her friends, and her family were blurs in the distance, as though they were fading away, swallowed by the darkness that was creeping into the corners of her mind. Amelia? James's voice was distant and muffled, as though he was calling to her from the end of a tunnel. She tried to turn to him, to reassure him that everything was fine, but her vision was clouded, and her limbs felt heavy, as though they were sinking into the very floor beneath her. Amelia, what's wrong? James's voice sounded closer now, but it was laced with a note of concern that only deepened the dread filling her chest. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. It was like the very air had thickened around her, smothering her thoughts, drowning her in silence. All she could hear was the relentless pounding of her own heart, the rush of blood in her ears, the whispering voice that had promised her doom. The woman standing at the altar moved. Amelia didn't see her take a step, but she felt her presence shift, felt the air around her pulse with energy. Her gaze never left Amelia's. The woman's hand, gloved in an old, tattered lace, reached out as if inviting Amelia closer, beckoning her toward the darkness that was closing in. Amelia tried to step back, but her feet wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, unable to tear her eyes away from the figure that seemed to draw her in. She could feel her breath quicken, her pulse racing, as if some invisible force was dragging her toward the altar.
Her vision blurred, her thoughts swirling in a chaotic mess of fear and confusion. She wanted to scream, to run, but her voice was caught in her throat. "Run, Amelia," the voice whispered again. A soft, gentle command that was both pleading and foreboding. It was coming from the woman, Amelia realized. Run before it's too late. And then, as if the world had suddenly stopped, everything went dark. The light from the candles, the warmth from the room, the sound of her heartbeat, all of it vanished in an instant. There was no longer a church, no longer a wedding. There was only darkness. The silence pressed in on her, suffocating her, drowning her in an abyss of emptiness.
She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. She tried to move, but her body wouldn't respond. It was as if she had been pulled into a void, a place where time and space no longer existed, where she was trapped in an endless, suffocating blackness. For what felt like an eternity, Amelia floated in the dark, her mind racing with panic and fear. She thought she heard the faintest sound, like a distant bell tolling, a mournful sound that echoed through the void, signaling the end of something. She thought she saw flashes of light, brief glimpses of images, her wedding dress, James's face, the woman at the altar, but they were all distorted, fading in and out like ghosts in the dark. She reached out, her hands grasping at the air, but there was nothing to hold on to, nothing to anchor her. It felt like she was falling into an endless abyss with no end in sight. The darkness consumed her, and she wondered if she would ever see the light again, if she would ever escape the suffocating grip of the curse. And then, as suddenly as it had all started, Amelia felt a jolt. A sudden, violent rush of air filled her lungs, and she gasped, her chest heaving as though she had just been pulled from the depths of the sea. Her eyes snapped open, and she was no longer in the church. She wasn't standing at the altar, staring at James. She wasn't in the middle of the wedding. She was lying on the cold, hard ground, her body shuddering with the shock of the transition. Amelia's head spun, and for a moment, she couldn't make sense of where she was. The familiar warmth of the church was gone, replaced by an unbearable cold. The wedding, the guests, the church, they had all disappeared. There was only darkness around her, the heavy silence pressing in, suffocating her, like the air had been stolen from her lungs. Her heart thudded in her chest, a heavy rhythm that matched the pounding in her head. She tried to sit up, but her body felt weak, like it had been drained of energy. She looked around, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but there was nothing but shadows, swirling and shifting in the blackness. She could feel the weight of the curse, the dread of the woman's words lingering in her mind. "You will die, just like Eleanor," the voice whispered again. And this time, it wasn't just in her head. It was real. The curse had taken hold. The cold, suffocating air grew thicker, and Amelia realized that whatever force had been pulling her into the darkness had only just begun. She wasn't free. She had only just begun the journey into something far worse. Her wedding had truly been her last. Amelia's eyes flickered open, and the first thing she felt was the cold, the kind of chill that sank into your bones and made the very air feel heavy. She tried to move, but her body felt stiff, as though it had been frozen in place for hours. Her hands trembled as she pushed herself up from the floor, the sharp, jagged stones digging into her palms. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she looked around, disoriented, her mind struggling to piece together what had happened. The church was silent, eerily so. The usual hum of life, the sounds of guests celebrating, of people laughing and chatting, had been replaced by a thick, unnatural stillness. The once gleaming wooden pews were now shadowed in the dim light that barely filtered through the stained glass windows. The air, which had once smelled of flowers and happiness, now had the unmistakable stench of decay. Amelia's eyes darted around, trying to find something, anything familiar, but everything felt foreign, twisted. As she sat there, her heart pounding in her chest, she glanced down at herself. Her wedding dress, once a beautiful, pristine white, was now soaked in blood. The fabric was heavy, clinging to her skin, and the red stains sped across the gown like dark, ominous rivers. She could feel the blood, sticky and cold, against her legs, but the pain, strangely, was absent. Her mind raced, but it couldn't quite make sense of it all. What had happened? Where was James? Where was everyone? The last thing she remembered was the church, the vows, the figure standing at the altar. And then, nothing. Amelia pushed herself up, feeling dizzy as she staggered to her feet, trying to steady herself. Her head spun, and she had to grab onto the back of a pew to keep from falling. As she looked around the church again, a wave of nausea rose within her, the air growing thicker with each passing moment. The once vibrant flowers that had adorned the altar were now wilted, their petals shriveled and dry, their color faded to a sickly brown. The candles, which had burned so brightly only hours ago, were now burnt out, their wicks blackened and useless. The church, once a place of joy and celebration, now felt like a tomb, a place of death. The silence pressed in on her, the weight of it almost suffocating. The church was empty, save for her. No one was here. No guests, no family, no friends. There was no sound but the beating of her own heart, each thud a reminder of how alone she truly was. Her mind, still foggy from whatever had happened, couldn't quite comprehend the emptiness that surrounded her. "James?" Amelia whispered hoarsely, her voice echoing in the stillness. She couldn't make out where he was, couldn't remember where she had last seen him. Her heart skipped a beat as she thought of him, her husband, the man she had dreamed of spending the rest of her life with.
Where was he? Her eyes scanned the altar again, hoping, praying that he would be standing there, waiting for her to come back. But there was nothing. The altar was empty. The space around her felt like a void, an empty shell that had once held so much life, so much love. But now, there was only darkness.
A sob caught in her throat, and Amelia's knees buckled beneath her. She fell to the cold stone floor, her hands trembling as she pressed them against her face, trying to hold herself together. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened, but there were no answers, no explanations. Just the blood, the silence, and the suffocating feeling that something terrible had transpired. It felt like hours before the first sound broke the silence. The creak of the church doors opening, followed by the soft shuffle of footsteps on the stone floor. Amelia looked up, her heart jumping in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She expected to see someone, anyone, come to her, but what she saw made her blood run cold. A figure stood in the doorway, a woman. Her wedding dress was tattered, yellowed with age, and her veil hung loosely around her face, obscuring her features. The woman's presence filled the doorway, her figure shrouded in the dim light of the church. Amelia's heart stopped as the woman's gaze locked with hers. There was no mistaking it. The woman's face was lifeless, cold, and empty, just like in her dream, just like the figure that had haunted her throughout the ceremony. Amelia tried to move, to speak, but her body refused to respond. She could only stare at the woman, her mouth dry, her body paralyzed with fear. The woman didn't move at first. She simply stood there, watching Amelia with empty eyes. And then, slowly, the woman took a step forward, and another, her footsteps echoing through the church like a death march. With each step, Amelia's breath grew heavier, her chest tightening with an overwhelming sense of dread. The woman's presence was suffocating, and with every inch she moved closer, Amelia's mind screamed for her to run, to get away, but her body couldn't obey. Finally, the woman stopped in front of her, just inches away. Amelia's heart raced, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she stared at the woman. She was standing there, waiting, as though time itself had come to a standstill. Amelia's eyes flickered to the woman's face, but it was impossible to make out her features. The veil obscured everything, hiding the woman's identity from her. But Amelia knew who she was. She could feel it deep within her bones. The woman lifted a hand, reaching out toward Amelia, and the air grew even colder. Amelia could feel the icy touch of the woman's fingers, ghostly and light, but the sensation sent a wave of nausea through her. It was as if the woman's touch was draining the very life from her, sucking the warmth from her soul. Amelia tried to pull back, but her body was frozen. She couldn't move. She couldn't escape. And then the woman spoke. Eleanor. The voice came, soft, hollow, like the whisper of the wind. You are mine now, just as she was before you. The words hit Amelia like a punch to the stomach. Eleanor, the cursed bride, the woman whose spirit had haunted the village for centuries, the woman who had been betrayed, whose wedding had turned into a nightmare, the woman who had died, her soul trapped in the church, forever waiting for the next bride to fall victim to the curse. Amelia's vision blurred, her mind spinning as the weight of the curse settled over her like a heavy shroud. She was not just Amelia anymore. She was another victim of the curse, another bride claimed by the darkness. She tried to scream, to fight back, but the words wouldn't come. The church felt like it was closing in on her, the walls pressing against her chest, suffocating her. The woman's hand was now resting on her shoulder, and the chill was unbearable, like ice seeping into her very bones. The woman's face remained hidden beneath the veil, but Amelia could feel the weight of her gaze, the coldness of her stare. It was as if the woman could see into her soul, into the very depths of her being. And then, as suddenly as it had all started, the woman's grip loosened, and the presence in the church seemed to dissipate. The coldness receded, but the sense of dread remained, lingering like a shadow in the corners of Amelia's mind. She gasped for breath, but there was no relief. She was still trapped in the church, still trapped by the curse. Hours later, the villagers found her. They whispered about the curse, about how the spirit of Eleanor had claimed another soul. Amelia's body was still warm, her heart still beating, but there was no light in her eyes. She was barely conscious, but it was clear that she had been changed. Something inside her had been broken, shattered by the curse that had claimed her. She was led away, carried by the villagers who had found her, their faces filled with pity and fear. They whispered to each other, their voices low and full of sorrow, as they spoke of the curse that had been passed down for generations. Amelia heard their words, but they didn't register. She couldn't understand. All she could see was the figure in the wedding dress, standing in the shadows, waiting for the next bride to make the same fatal mistake. As they carried her away from the church, Amelia's eyes flickered one last time toward the altar, and in the farthest corner of her vision, she saw the woman, the spirit of Eleanor, waiting. And Amelia knew then that the curse would never end. It would always be there, waiting for the next bride, the next victim to claim. The darkness would continue, and the cycle would never be broken.